Tritone substitutions are a great way to add a little something extra to your playing, but also to your composing or your arranging. A great device for adding a bit of tension. You find them all over jazz music, gospel music, and classical music. As usual with these videos, we'll have a look at what a tritone substitution is, how and why it works, and then we'll look at some ways that we can use them. But first, what is a tritone? Tritone, 3 tones. It's an interval of 3 tones, which is the same as a sharpened fourth or an augmented fourth or a flattened fifth or a diminished fifth. Whatever your interval name calling preference is, we don't need to call it any of those, we can just call it a tritone. So a tritone from C would be 3 tones up, so we move a tone and then another tone and then another tone. So a tritone from C is F sharp or G flat. Or a tritone from E flat, we move up 1 tone, and then another tone, and then another tone. E flat and A is a tritone. So the interval of a tritone is actually the halfway point of an octave. If we take our E flat, the A is exactly halfway between an E flat and an E flat. So we've got 3 tones or 6 semitones to the A, and then we've got 6 semitones or 3 tones up to the E flat. So that means, unlike any other interval, when you invert it, it stays the same. Interesting. That's a tritone, but what's a tritone substitution? Well, in the simplest form, a tritone substitution is when we take a dominant 7 chord and we substitute it with a dominant 7 chord from a tritone away. You want more? Okay, so why do they work so nicely? You might have heard people say that along with our root note, the 2 most important notes of any chord are the 3rd and the 7th. When we play these together on guitar and the piano, these are called shell voicings or skeleton chords. The 3rd and the 7th reveal the fundamental characteristics of the chord, whether it's a major chord or a minor chord, whether it's a dominant chord or not. Now, if we take a look at a dominant chord, let's play the shell voicing of a G7 chord. So I've got my root note and I've got my 3rd and my 7th, F and B. Now here's the cool bit. Let's look at a shell voicing of a dominant chord a tritone away. So a tritone away from G would be D flat, 3rd and 7th of a D flat, 3rd and 7th. Well, would you look at that? It's only the 3rd and 7th of G7. So dominant chords that are a tritone away both share the same 3rd and 7th, albeit inverted. So the 3rd of a G chord is the 7th of a D flat 7, and the 7th of a G chord is the 3rd of a D flat 7. So this is the main reason why tritone substitutions work so well. Dominant chords a tritone apart both share the same 3rd and 7th, albeit inverted. So if we substitute out one chord for the other, even when we add back in the other chord tones, the fact that the core of the chord, the 3rd and 7th, the important character notes, the skeleton of the chord, stays the same, it means it works perfectly as a substitution. And because of the nature of a dominant chord being inherently dissonant and unstable, adding those non-diatonic chord tones back in only enhances that dissonance and instability, and therefore works perfectly. I made a video, What's So Special About Dominant Chords, and in that I talk about how with dominant 7 chord there's this built-in tension from the tritone within the chord. Within the chord there's a tritone between the 3rd and the 7th, and that tritone wants to pull us to the resolution, to the tonic. In jazz and funk and hip hop and the like, it's really common to accentuate that tension on a dominant 7 chord by adding in chromatic extensions to the chord, which is basically any note that isn't part of the key center. A pretty popular voicing of a dominant chord that increases that dissonance is something like this, which is a G altered chord. So I've got my G in the bass, but my right hand here I've got my 3rd and 7th, very important, and then I've got a sharp 9 and a sharp 5 to increase that distance. G altered to C. Now, if we take that G altered shape and we think back to our tritone substitution. What's the tritone of a G? D flat, well done. D flat. Oh look, this looks a lot like, for me, a D flat 13 voicing. I've got my 3rd and my 7th, and I've got a 13 and a 9. So another way to think about potentially tritone substitution could be play the altered chord and then put that tritone, or the sharp 11 or flat 5 in the bass. Okay, that's what they are and why they work. Now let's talk about how we can implement them into our work and playing. Well, we use these tritone substitutions on dominant chords, or 5 chords, and a 5 chord normally moves to some sort of 1 chord. So tritone substitution can be as simple as just taking the dominant 7 chord and swapping it out for dominant 7 chord a tritone away. So we have our simple progression here, and then we take that 5 chord, or the dominant 7th chord, swap it out for dominant 7 chord tritone away, and we get nice and pretty simple, yeah? So this works really well with our super common chord progression, the 2, 5, 1. What we do is take our 5 chord, we substitute it with a dominant 7 chord tritone away, or what we could call the flat 2, 7 chord. Then what we have is a really nice little walk down from our 2 chord to our flat 2, 7 chord to our 1. We do like a nice little bit of voice leading like that. Now I'm sure you probably noticed that the tritone of our 5 chord is just a semitone above the 1, our target chord. So another way to think about this could be that we're replacing our 5 chord with a dominant 7 chord, a semitone above or half step above our target chord. So although I've been calling the tritone sub of a G a D flat 7, you could think of it as a C sharp 7, and that might be easier if you want to think of these as being replaced by a semitone above the target note. To think of that as a C sharp rather than a D flat. It might help you think that way. You see, I'm all about flats. I find it much easier to think about chords as flats than I do sharps. Is that just me, or is that a piano player thing? Any other piano players out there? Okay, thinking about what we've just learned, with a chord progression like this, you might think there's limited opportunities to use tritone substitutions. Just on that G7, on the dominant 7 chord, you could swap that out for a D flat 7. But what if I told you that there's a world where we could add in a tritone substitution before every chord? It's true. But how, Michael? You said that we should only be swapping out dominant 7 chords. How's this going to work? Well, in order for this to make sense, we're going to tritone substitute in partnership with secondary dominants. I've just made a video all about secondary dominants, so feel free to watch that if you haven't already. Essentially, the idea behind secondary dominants is that we can approach any chord with the 5 chord of that chord. So regardless of what function that chord is playing within the context of the song, if we think of that chord as a 1 chord or the tonic, then we can add in before it the 5 chord. So if we added secondary dominants into this chord progression, we'd get this. So the C7 is the 5 chord of F, the E7 is the 5 chord of A, the D7 is the 5 chord of G, and the G7 is the 5 chord of C. So now we've got a load more dominant chords that we can turn into tritone substitutions. So where we once thought with this chord progression there wasn't any room to add tritone substitutions, thanks to secondary dominants, we've got a bunch of dominant chords that we can tritone sub. Magic. With this approach, we can have fun with chord progressions like this. This is the 3-6-2-5-1, which is a really common jazz progression, although chord progressions where the root note moves around the circle of fifths are really common in loads of styles of music. Due to the fact that these chords are all a fifth apart, it means that we can turn these minor 7ths into dominant 7 chords, making them secondary dominant chords. This is pretty common in a jazz setting. And now we can have fun creating some really nice chromatic voice leading by tritone subbing out some of these chords. Okay, let's substitute our 3 chord and our 2 chord for their tritones. So our 3 chord is an E, tritone away from E is B flat 7. Our 2 chord, D minor, tritone from D is A flat. So we'll stick that in there too. So now what we've got, as you can see, really nice chromatic line leading down to our 5th before the resolution. How nice does that sound? Now if we go back to where we were, and this time we'll sub out the 6 chord and the 5 chord. So our 6 chord is an A, and we'll sub that out for its tritone, E flat. And our 5 chord, the G, will sub out for its tritone, D flat. So now we've got a really similar result to before, but this time our chromatic walk down starts from the 3 and walks down all the way to the 1 chord. How nice. So although theoretically we could put in tritone subs before every chord, please don't put them in before every chord the whole way through your song, because it diminishes the effect of them and it sounds too busy. Well, that's my opinion anyway. You do whatever makes you happy. So that's a really standard way that you'll see tritone subs being used and how you can use them. But there is another really common application of this too. It's pretty commonplace to add in the tritone substitution in between the 5 chord and the 1 chord. So you don't replace the 5 chord, you play the 5 chord and then you play the tritone substitution and then you play the 1 chord. I think this is a really nice way to build tension. So we introduce some tension with our diatonic 7 chord, and then we increase that tension with the tritone, and then we release the tension moving to the 1 chord. Really nice, and it's super common. So let's introduce this to our previous progression. So we started off with C, F, A minor, G, C, and then we added in our secondary dominants. And now this time, instead of turning our secondary dominants into the tritone substitutions, we're going to add in the tritone substitutions between the secondary dominant and our original chord. So then we get nice. Let's do the same thing with our 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. Instead of swapping out our dominant chords, we're going to add the tritones in between. So that's the other typical way you'll be using them. Now, can we actually call it a tritone substitution if we're not actually substituting a chord? We're just inserting the tritone in after the chord. A tritone insertion. Nah, I don't like that. Using tritone substitutions like this in between chords is an easy way, as a keys player or guitarist, to add a bit of interest to our playing without having to have already planned the substitutions beforehand with the rest of the band. Throwing in a tritone sub in between chords isn't really going to step on anyone's toes, and you might even gain some overdue respect from your bandmates. It can also be a useful way to think if you're an improviser too. Just outlining that tritone sub before you resolve to the next chord can add some really interesting tension and then release. It's definitely something worth exploring if you're an improviser. I will say though, as I often do with things like this, is that you should be sensitive to the setting that you're in. If you're throwing in these tritone subs on the fly, not all types of music, styles and songs are going to be suitable to do that with. So do it when appropriate. And also, like other sort of substitutions that you might find yourself throwing in there, you might need to be sensitive and pay attention to the melody. Depending on how long you're sticking on these tritone subs for, you might need to check how well they work with the existing melody that you've got going. Sometimes it'll be fine, sometimes you might need to tweak the melody, and sometimes you might realise that it was better left as it was. You often find that tritone subs are used a lot in turnarounds at the end of a verse or a chorus, possibly because it skirts around that potential issue of interfering with a typically diatonic melody, because commonly there's no melody over a turnaround. So be mindful. you may have noticed already that often in the video, as I've been playing the tritone substitutions, I've often voiced them as a 7 sharp 11 chord. Now that's a pretty common way to voice a tritone substitution, and there is a reason for that. Not only do they sound great, but what that sharp 11 does is it retains the original root note of the chord that we're replacing. So with our G7 that we've replaced with a D flat 7, by playing that D flat 7 with a sharp 11, I'm introducing back that G. But what that also does is with making it a 7 sharp 11 chord, it puts it within the context of a melodic minor scale. Because normally you'd think of a D flat 7 as being the 5 chord of G flat. But that G flat has obviously a G flat, not a G natural. So by playing a sharp 11 on my D flat, it makes it sound a bit more ambiguous. It doesn't make it feel like it's going to resolve to the 1. It gives us that nice crunchy jazz sound. And using the 7 sharp 11 also opens the door for us using the Lydian dominant scale in our melodies and our soloing, which is the 4th mode of the melodic minor scale. It comes from, like for D flat 7 sharp 11, we're referencing A flat melodic minor. So using the 7 with a sharp 11 is a really standard way to voice and solo with tritone substitutions, but it's not obligatory. A simple 7 chord or 9 chord or 13 chord is going to do the job just as well, and it's going to sound very similar, and you might even prefer it, which is all that really matters, right? So there you go, tritone substitutions. Everything you need to know to get your head around them and start using them in your playing. And I hope there was something in there that was useful for you. If you enjoyed it, maybe you'd like some other videos too, so check those out, or hang tight, head back when I've got another one. Thanks for being here.